Well, it was the first program was an hour show live, and I chose the interviewee, and it was Marcus Allen, who's a publisher of Nexus magazine. Mm-hmm. And I knew he was very interested in the moon landings, which I am as well. I've watched lots of stuff about the moon landings, and I've seen irrefutable evidence that the film evidence from the moon, the stills and the moving images, are faked. Absolutely, irrefutably, undeniably faked. That doesn't mean they didn't go, but it means that we didn't see them go, and we didn't see what happened to them there. And there's plenty of evidence that, I think the debate is still open whether they went or not. I mean, there are lots of people who think that they couldn't have gone because of the Van Allen belts, and the radiation would have killed them because they were protected by, effectively, aluminium cooking foil. That was how thick their capsule was. And, if you run through a rainstorm or walk through a rainstorm, it makes no difference. You're going to get wet. And if you fly through the Van Allen belts, which are highly radioactive, you're going to start vomiting inside your spacesuit long before you get to the moon. And also your film would all be fogged as well, which it wasn't, clearly. So
that's right.
I think it's highly unlikely that they went. And as I say, there's all this film evidence. I mean, in the later missions, when they had the lunar rover, there's one picture on the moon where there's footprints all around the lunar rover, showing that the ground is soft enough to take a footprint, but there are no tyre tracks leading from behind the lunar rover or in front of the lunar rover or in between the wheels. So
you mentioned the cameras. The camera you mentioned, it was Kodak, wasn't it?
The film was Kodak.
Eastman.
The camera Hasselblad, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I know the Kodak Eastman apparently have the history of their company in the foyer of their head office, showing all the achievements and the places their cameras have been. And yet, there is no mention of the camera having been used on the moon. It's just been dropped out of their history altogether. And I have read the Kodak, or the people who designed the system, saying that there is no way it could possibly have been used on the moon. It's just a physical impossibility. So you're dead right. You're dead right.
The cameras that they had were fixed to their chest. They didn't have, and you can't even see what you're looking at. So
well, you can actually go to the sound stage in America, can't you? Where some of these pictures clearly were taken. But it's a fascinating subject. But if I can bring this back to you, obviously you've concluded, as so many have, that so many of the moon landing pictures were faked. What do you think that implies then? What do you
have to ask yourself, wherever you see these lies perpetrated, you have to ask yourself, qui bono, who benefits from telling these big lies? And, there is real politic in the world where decisions are made for reasons of, what is seen as a necessity for governments. And at the time of the moon landings, from 1969 to 1973, they were fighting a war in Vietnam, and the protests were growing and growing, and they needed a distraction. They also had to live up to the promise that John Kennedy had made before he was killed in 1963, saying that before the end of the decade they would put a man on the moon and bring him back safely. Now, this was a wild promise. Now, there are those who believe he made this wild promise because he knew of other technologies, Nazi German technologies, for instance, and so on, that could have got a man on the moon. But using rockets and the technology they had, there's no way they could have done it, according to many people, including NASA itself at that time. So why did they do it? How did they benefit? Well, they distracted the American public away from the Vietnam War, and they made the American people feel good, as they planted an American flag on, a soundstage somewhere,
They were getting shown up by the Russians, weren't they, for a few years previous to that?
Well, a lot of people said, okay, if the Americans did do that, why didn't the Russians blow the whistle? But, there's lots of evidence the Russians were complicit for other reasons, other political reasons, in what was going on.
Was it Hoagland who suggested that Russia and America were actually working together behind the scenes on the whole thing?
Well, that's another theory, isn't it? That like if you look at George Orwell, I mean, we always have to be at war with somebody. Somebody always has to be the enemy. And after the Cold War ended, the enemy had to be the war on terror. So it had to be this sort of mythic enemy that you could never beat. Uh-huh. So, but at the time, the enemy was, in the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union, and if secretly they were meeting and having rapprochement, but pretending, in public to be at each other's throat, then it helped those in power sell their weapons and spend all the taxpayers' money on armaments and enriching those people in power. So, you can see why they would do that. A lot of people think that Stanley Kubrick filmed the moon landings and was then rewarded with the money to make 2001. And that he also left lots of clues to having done this in the film The Shining.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this. We mentioned this previously as well.
Yeah, there's evidence online. I go look at it.
Yeah, there's a torrent that you can download called Stanley Kubrick's Shoeboxes, and that sort of evidences, it goes a little bit deeper. I think there's some of his family members get involved in that as well. My memory's pretty useless these days, but that's a really good little mini video to download relevant to that one. So,
yeah,
and that goes into his connections and what he was thinking, and it goes into a few details about how he thought the guys in the shadows were sort of fooling people, and he was trying to give as many hints as he could by the look of it. So,
if you look at that film, if you look at The Shining, a lot of it is nothing like the Stephen King novel. For instance, the little kid who rides the tricycle down the corridors in that hotel has got a hand-knitted sweater with Apollo 11 on it. The Jack Nicholson character, who's supposed to be there to write a book, that's why he's looking after the hotel in the off-season. There's a scene which is never in the book where he's writing his novel in a locked room, and no one is allowed in the locked room, and eventually his wife goes in there, and all he has typed over and over and over again is, "All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." And the all is at capital A, 1-1, Apollo 11. There are so many clues in the film that you have to think, well, it can't be chance. But
Eyes Wide Shut is another one that I think most people bring that one up when people start talking about the Illuminati or ritual, and especially Stanley Kubrick. But it's an eye-opening film, to use a bit of a pun related to the title, but that's a great film. I love that film. There's got so much symbolism in that one.
Yeah, the thing about that film is that his agreement with his contract with the film studio was that they will not edit it after he had finished editing it, and there's no way they could edit it at all. And then he mysteriously died after he'd edited it, but before it was released, and the studio cut 20 minutes from the film or thereabouts. And hacked it to pieces. Now, I'd love to see those outtakes, but you're never going to see them. There's never going to be a director's cut, and you have to ask yourself why.
Well, it's like something. It's generational, isn't it? It's like the D notices. Like, for example, the Dunblane shootings. For example, you've got evidence that's kept away for generations. So by the time the third generation comes around, yeah, I mean, it's. The family members who care about it and the people who are running around trying to tell the world that are usually dead and gone. Well, the new generation comes along and says, "Oh yeah, he was involved in this. This was a false flag. That was a false flag. This guy was telling us this and that." But they don't. It's less of an issue a couple of generations down the line. They love to do that all the time.
Well, we know, for instance, that that Pearl Harbor was known about by LBJ. We know that Operation Northwoods was squashed by Kennedy, that they would have operated a fake mission where Cuba would have blown up an American Airlines plane in flight, and therefore that would have been the excuse to invade Cuba. But it never happened because Kennedy said no. So we know that the American government, and certainly our government, are capable of false flag operations.
Mm-hmm. So where do you see it going in the immediate future then, Theo? And I know that's completely subjective, but where do you feel it's going? The whole thing.
It worries me a lot. I mean, there is a lot of evidence that people are waking up, if you like to use that expression. But there's also a lot of evidence that even if they were to wake up, and even if they were going to go, well, what can we do? What can we do? If you look at revolutions in the past, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution in 1917, the people who took over, first of all, people were sufficiently motivated because they were personally affected by unfairness and starvation and so on, that they revolted. But the people who took over after the revolution were just as bad, if not worse, than the people who were in power before. And those revolutions were funded by the same people in both cases, or apparently were, that are in power today. So it worries me enormously that even if you were to reach that critical mass where we could make a difference and people would make a difference, that whatever they did would be undermined instantly by people seizing power from those people who inveigle themselves into those groups, have the funding and the contacts to steal the power. So, I mean, I've thought a lot about this, and the only thing I can think of where it would really work for people would be if we could read people's minds, and that, of course, is, well, in the short term, pretty unlikely. I mean, there are plenty of people who think in the past, once there was a golden age where we could read people's minds, but if we could meet people in the street and instantly realise that person was a psychopath and therefore not fit to govern us, then we wouldn't let them. But I think, how else would you know? Because, the psychopaths who do govern us are very convincing to the vast majority of people, aren't they?
Well, yes, they are. I suppose by very nature, that's most of our politicians are sociopaths, I guess. But we've had a good question come in from Steve Gibbon, who's asking where you stand personally on the Freeman thing. So maybe I need to water that down a bit and ask, what is your opinion of the Freeman movement? Any opinions from what you've discussed?
Well, I'm quite excited about the Freeman movement, actually. I interviewed John Harris quite a long time ago. And, I think that there is a lot of scope within the Freeman movement. I think quite a lot of people have to be very cautious about what they do, because it is not as simple as maybe they think. Send back bills, accepted for value and all this stuff, and declare that they're not the straw man, they're the real man, and let's go to court and all this, because they could end up bankrupt or with nothing, And I think if you've got nothing to lose, then it's probably a good place to be. But if you actually have something that you value, even if it's only that you're living on benefits, it might be quite risky for a lot of people to do this unless they really, really understand what they're doing,
That's right. I see statute law, I think I mentioned recently, as an imposition of pure occult law. That is what statute law is. You have to invite it in and form a contract with it, a bit like inviting the vampire into your house, for example.
I am still here.
Good. Theo, just before the break, I believe you nipped off to get the list that you mentioned earlier of the people that you've interviewed. So, as the question at the time was, what perhaps were some of the highlights for you? And I'll allow you to define whatever was interesting and why.
Looking at the list, it is really difficult to pick any that are... they were all pretty good. I mean, I think out of 75 shows that I did, I think there are 2 that probably I wouldn't want to see again, and maybe 3, but the rest are all, I thought they were pretty good. I mean, people like Daniel Oberchiki, who was on the bus that blew up in Tavistock Square.
Yes, we know Daniel.
He wrote a book called The Fourth Bomb, which was, but he was a very good witness, and his version of what happened is very different from the version about which they didn't have an official inquiry,
And completely excluded from the BBC programme just a few weeks ago about it all as well.
Well, how surprising not. Those conspiracy file programmes on the BBC, what they do is they set up this straw man, the weakest possible argument that they can find, and then they go, well, we'll disprove that, and that disproves everything, So, what do you expect? Right, to get back to my list, there's a chap called Alan Wilson, who's a researcher into ancient history, who was fascinating and well worth checking out. He's written lots of books about the 2 King Arthurs that we genuinely did have, and that the Welsh people effectively are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So that's quite extraordinary. And there are people who are talking about what's happening in the child courts and so on, like John Hemming MP and Brian Gerrish, who also talks about common purpose, and they were good shows.